The most corrupted bloodlines of Appalachia. How inbreeding created incurable diseases. It is a story of isolation, of genetic deterioration, and the devastating consequences that emerge when family trees fail to branch. Deep in the mist-shrouded hollows of eastern Kentucky, where the ancient Appalachian mountains fold into themselves like the pages of a forbidden book, there existed communities that time and progress seem to forget. Our investigation takes us to these isolated pockets of America, back to the winter of 1957, when a local physician named Dr. Thomas Harrington first documented what would later become known as Shelton syndrome. In Ellesley County, Kentucky, one of the most impoverished regions in the United States during the mid-20th century, our story begins. As coal mines closed and economic opportunities vanished, many families retreated deeper into the mountains, forming isolated communities cut off from the outside world by both geography and choice. By 1957, the Shelton family had inhabited the same valley for over 7 generations. Their ancestral property, nearly 200 acres of rugged woodland, was nestled between 2 steep ridgelines that effectively cut them off from neighboring communities, especially during the harsh winter months when snow could block the single dirt road for weeks at a time. The first time I visited the Shelton homestead, I knew something was profoundly wrong, Dr. Harrington wrote in his medical journal. 3 generations lived in connected cabins around a central clearing, and the physical similarities were striking, not just family resemblance, but distinctive abnormalities that appeared with alarming frequency. The family patriarch, Elijah Shelton, then 79, had married his first cousin Sarah in 1895. Their children had predominantly married within the family or with members of 2 other nearby families with whom they'd intermarried for generations, the Rosses and the Bennetts. By the 1950s, the family tree had become so intertwined that most children in the youngest generation were simultaneously cousins, second cousins, and sometimes even aunt or uncle to their own siblings. Dr. Harrington had been called to the property after local authorities received reports from a traveling Bible salesman about children with severe deformities. What the doctor found would eventually lead to one of the first modern American studies on the genetic consequences of consanguineous relationships. A constellation of symptoms was exhibited by the youngest generation of Sheltons, distinctive facial features, including widely spaced eyes, unusually small heads, and malformed jaws, cognitive impairments ranging from mild to severe, and most notably, a progressive neurological disorder that caused tremors in childhood and eventually led to loss of motor control by early adulthood. In the main cabin, Dr. Harrington noted, I examined Miriam Shelton, aged 32, who exhibited advanced symptoms of what I now believe is a hereditary neurological condition. Her hands shook uncontrollably, her speech was slurred, and according to family members, she had been deteriorating steadily since her mid-20s. 2 of her brothers showed similar symptoms, though less advanced. But it was the children who most concerned Dr. Harrington. Of the 19 children under the age of 18 living on the property, 14 showed signs of developmental delays, physical abnormalities, or early symptoms of the progressive disorder. A rate far exceeding the national average was seen in the 5 who had died in infancy or early childhood from congenital heart defects. The most troubling case was that of young Emmet Shelton, age 9, the doctor wrote. Despite having never left the valley in his life, he seemed to suffer from symptoms mimicking advanced radiation exposure, hair loss, skin lesions, and immune deficiencies. Yet, this was clearly a genetic condition, not environmental. The isolation of the Shelton family wasn't merely geographical. As Dr. Harrington investigated further, he discovered that a deep-seated distrust of outsiders had been reinforced through generations of family law. Elijah Shelton's grandfather had fought for the Confederacy and retreated to the mountains after the Civil War, believing the government would eventually come to seize their land. This paranoia had been passed down, strengthened by occasional negative interactions with authorities and outsiders, Harrington observed. They believe the outside world wishes them harm. And ironically, this belief has led them to engage in practices that have indeed caused profound harm to their own bloodline. What made the Shelton case particularly significant in medical literature was not just the prevalence of genetic disorders, but the emergence of what appeared to be an entirely new syndrome, one that would later be documented in several other isolated Appalachian communities with similar patterns of consanguinity. As winter deepened in 1957, Dr. Harrington made the difficult journey to the Shelton property multiple times, gradually gaining the family's trust and collecting medical data that would eventually be published in obscure medical journals, largely forgotten until recent genetic research brought renewed interest to these isolated communities. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel if you want to discover the dark hidden histories of America's most isolated communities. These forgotten stories reveal truths about human nature and genetics that many would prefer to keep buried in the mountain hollow. Subscribe now to ensure you don't miss the next chapter in this disturbing investigation. By the spring of 1958, Dr. Harrington had compiled enough evidence to present his findings to colleagues at the University of Kentucky Medical Center. His presentation, titled Consanguinity and Novel Genetic Disorders in Isolated Appalachian Communities, was met with skepticism and discomfort. The topic of familial intermarriage was considered taboo in medical circles at the time, and many physicians preferred to attribute the symptoms he described to poor nutrition, environmental factors, or mountain culture. But Dr. Harrington persisted, inviting Dr. Eleanor Wainwright, a geneticist from Johns Hopkins University, to visit Ellerslie County and examine the Shelton family firsthand. Dr. Wainwright had studied genetic disorders in isolated communities in Europe and recognized the significance of what was occurring in the Appalachian Mountains. What we're seeing here is a textbook example of genetic load magnification, Dr. Wainwright wrote after her visit in June 1958. When closely related individuals have children, recessive genes that might normally remain dormant have a much higher chance of expression. In a population that has practiced consanguineous marriage for multiple generations, we're witnessing the cumulative effect, essentially a magnifying glass on the family's genetic weaknesses. Multiple recessive genes were carried by the Shelton family that, when combined from both parents, produce severe outcomes. But most alarming was the emergence of what the doctors began to call Shelton's neurological deterioration, the progressive tremor and motor control loss that seemed to affect roughly 60% of family members by adulthood. Dr. Wainwright's examination of family records revealed patterns consistent with autosomal recessive inheritance, a genetic condition that only manifests when a child inherits the affected gene from both parents. In normal populations, such recessive conditions are rare because individuals typically must match with an unrelated carrier. But in the Shelton family, where most adults shared significant portions of their genetic code, the odds increased dramatically with each generation. I reviewed the family Bible, which contained birth and death records going back to 1815, noted Dr. Wainwright. The pattern becomes clear around 1880 when the family became increasingly isolated. Infant mortality rates doubled, and references to the shaking sickness begin to appear by 1910. By the 1950s, it had become endemic. The community's isolation wasn't merely self-imposed. Economic factors played a significant role as well. When coal mining declined in eastern Kentucky after World War II, many of the region's young people migrated to industrial centers like Detroit and Cincinnati. But families like the Sheltons, with limited education and visible physical differences that might mark them as outsiders, remained in their mountain homesteads, further concentrating the affected gene pool. In July 1958, tragedy struck when Miriam Shelton died after choking during a severe tremor episode. Her death spurred Dr. Harrington to take more decisive action. With the reluctant permission of Elijah Shelton, he arranged for two of the younger children, cousins Timothy and Ruth, ages 7 and 8, to receive treatment and evaluation at the University of Kentucky Medical Center. The children's appearance in Lexington caused a stir among medical staff. Beyond their distinctive facial features, both exhibited developmental delays and early signs of the tremor condition. Blood samples were taken for the limited genetic testing available at the time, and brain studies were conducted using the emerging technology of electroencephalography, EEG. Results were unlike anything I've seen before, reported Dr. Franklin Pierce, the neurologist who examined the children. The pattern of electrical activity suggests a fundamental difference in how signals are transmitted through the central nervous system. This isn't simply a case of developmental delay. It appears to be a unique neurological condition. For 3 weeks, the children stayed at the medical center before returning to their family compound. During that time, they became something of a curiosity, with medical students and doctors from other departments coming to observe them. This attention, while scientifically valuable, raised ethical concerns that would later be addressed in changes to human research protocols. Back in the mountain hollow, tensions were rising. Some family members viewed the medical interest as intrusive, while others began to question the traditional practice of marrying within the extended family. Elijah's grandson, Joseph Shelton, 22, had recently returned from a brief stint in the military. He had been discharged after his tremors became noticeable and was particularly vocal about the need for change. Grandpa Elijah always told us that outsiders carried disease and weakness, Joseph was quoted as saying to Dr. Harrington. But I've seen the world a bit now. I think maybe we got it backward. Maybe the sickness is coming from inside, not outside. This growing awareness created a rift within the family. The older generation, led by Elijah and his children, maintained that their bloodline must remain pure to protect their land and heritage. The younger adults, seeing the suffering of their children and siblings, were beginning to question these long-held beliefs. By the fall of 1958, Dr. Wainwright had prepared a comprehensive report on the Shelton family's condition. Her recommendations were straightforward but culturally challenging. The pattern of intermarriage must end to prevent further concentration of genetic disorders. Based on my analysis, continued consanguineous marriages within this population will result in increasing severity of symptoms and likely introduction of new genetic disorders, she wrote. The condition I've termed Shelton's neurological deterioration appears to be progressive and ultimately terminal, with no effective treatments currently available. What neither doctor could have anticipated was how their scientific interests would collide with deeply held cultural beliefs, governmental authority, and the complex ethics of intervention in private family matters, a collision that would bring national attention to the hidden hollows of Appalachia in the years to come. The winter of 1958 to 1959 was particularly harsh in eastern Kentucky. Heavy snowfall isolated the Shelton compound for weeks at a time, preventing Dr. Harrington from making his regular visits. During this period of isolation, events took a dramatic turn that would forever alter the family's trajectory. Joseph Shelton, the young man who had begun questioning family traditions after his military service, made a decision that would be seen as betrayal by some and salvation by others. In January 1959, during a brief thaw that made roads passable, he transported his two young cousin siblings, Martha and John Shelton, ages 6 and 4, to the county seat of Boonville. Both children exhibited severe symptoms of developmental delays and early signs of the tremor condition. Joseph took them directly to the county courthouse, where he made a formal request for state intervention, claiming the children were being denied necessary medical care due to the family's beliefs. This unprecedented action from within the family itself forced local authorities to respond. "I love my family," Joseph told the county judge. "But these children deserve a chance at a different life. The way we've been living, marrying our own kin, it's killing us slow. I've seen what happens to folks with the shakes. I'm starting to get them myself. These kids deserve better." County Judge Wilfred Davis was initially reluctant to intervene in what many locals considered private family matters. However, the visible conditions of Martha and John, combined with Dr. Harrington's medical documentation, compelled him to act. He ordered the children to be temporarily placed in state care for medical evaluation and contacted the Kentucky Department of Public Welfare. News of this action reached the Shelton compound through the local general store owner, setting off a crisis within the family. Elijah, despite his advanced age, led a contingent of family members to Boonville, armed with hunting rifles, demanding the return of the children. The confrontation at the courthouse on February 3, 1959, nearly escalated to violence before local law enforcement managed to defuse the situation. "These are our children, our blood," Elijah reportedly told Judge Davis. "The government has no right to steal them because they don't like our ways. We've lived in these mountains since before Kentucky was a state. We know how to care for our own." The standoff brought unwanted attention to the situation. A reporter from the Louisville Courier-Journal caught wind of the story and published an article titled, "Mountain Family Fights for Children, Ancient Ways Clash with Modern Medicine." While the article was relatively sympathetic to the family's desire to maintain custody, it also described in clinical detail the physical abnormalities present in many family members and explicitly mentioned the practice of cousin marriage. This publicity created a delicate situation for authorities. In the 1950s, state intervention in family matters was less common than today, particularly in rural areas where traditional values of family autonomy remained strong. However, the medical evidence was compelling enough that Judge Davis maintained his order for temporary state custody of Martha and John pending a full hearing. During this period, Dr. Eleanor Wainwright returned to Kentucky to examine the children and testify about the genetic basis of their condition. Her testimony would prove crucial in the proceedings that followed. What we're observing is not neglect in the traditional sense, Dr. Wainwright explained to the court. The Shelton family clearly cares for these children. However, the practice of consanguineous marriage over multiple generations has created a medical emergency. These children are suffering from preventable genetic disorders that will likely shorten their lives and cause significant suffering. If you're feeling as shocked as I am about this family situation, leave a comment saying some tradition should never be continued. This isn't just about understanding history, it's about recognizing how isolation and misguided beliefs can lead to generational suffering. The court hearing in March 1959 became a landmark case in Kentucky family law, though it remained obscure in national jurisprudence. Judge Davis ultimately ruled that Martha and John Shelton would remain in state care, becoming wards of the Commonwealth of Kentucky, one of the first cases where genetic considerations influenced custody decisions. The ruling sent shockwaves through similar communities in the Appalachian region. Families who had practiced consanguineous marriage for generations suddenly faced the possibility of state intervention. Some, like the neighboring Ross family, who had intermarried with the Sheltons for generations, began encouraging their young people to seek partners from more distant communities. For the Shelton family, the court decision triggered a permanent split. Elijah and his oldest children maintained their isolation and traditional practices, deeply embittered by what they viewed as government overreach. Joseph and a small group of younger family members, however, chose to leave the compound and resettle in Boonville, where they sought education and integration into mainstream society. By the summer of 1959, state health officials had initiated a broader investigation into isolated communities throughout eastern Kentucky, and what they discovered was troubling. At least 7 other extended family groups exhibited similar patterns of genetic disorders associated with consanguinity. The phenomenon wasn't limited to Kentucky, similar situations were documented in isolated hollows of West Virginia, Tennessee, and North Carolina. Dr. Harrington continued his work with the Shelton family, focusing particularly on understanding and documenting Shelton's neurological deterioration. With better equipment and increased interest from the medical community, he was able to better characterize the condition. Onset typically began with mild tremors around age 8 to 10, progressing to more severe motor control issues by the late teens, cognitive decline in the 20s, and eventually fatal complications by the mid-30s. The tragedy is that each generation's symptoms appear earlier and more severe than the last, he noted in a 1960 paper. What began as tremors appearing in adulthood in the early 1900s now manifests in childhood with correspondingly reduced life expectancy. Martha and John Shelton, the children at the center of the custody battle, were placed with a foster family in Lexington. Their medical care was overseen by specialists at the University of Kentucky, where experimental treatments were attempted to slow the progression of their neurological condition. These treatments, primarily based on emerging understanding of neurotransmitters, provided modest benefits, but no cure. Meanwhile, Joseph Shelton's decision to break with family tradition came with personal consequences. His own tremors worsened through 1959, and by 1960, at age 24, he was experiencing difficulty with fine motor skills that made employment challenging. Nevertheless, he remained adamant that the cycle had to be broken. "I may not have much time left before the shakes take me completely," he told Dr. Harrington during an examination in April 1960. "But I made sure those kids have a chance at something different. And I won't be having children of my own. The sickness stops with me." The early 1960s marked a period of rapid advancement in genetic science, and the Shelton family case attracted increasing attention from researchers. In 1962, Dr. Wainwright secured a grant from the National Institutes of Health to conduct a comprehensive genetic study of the extended Shelton kinship network, including the related Ross and Bennett families. This study was among the first to thoroughly document the effects of multi-generational consanguinity in an American population. Blood samples were collected from 67 family members across 4 generations, and detailed medical histories were compiled wherever possible. What makes the Shelton case scientifically significant is the relative isolation of genetic factors, Dr. Wainwright wrote in her research proposal. Unlike urban populations with diverse environmental exposures, this community has maintained relatively consistent living conditions for generations, making it easier to isolate genetic influences from environmental ones. Throughout 1962 and 1963, the research team established a field laboratory in Boonville, where they conducted examinations and interviews. Their findings were published in the Journal of Medical Genetics in 1964 in an article titled, Genetic Load in an Isolated Appalachian Kindred, Implications of Consanguinity Over 7 Generations. The study identified 3 primary conditions prevalent in the Shelton lineage. Shelton's neurological deterioration, the progressive tremor condition that affected approximately 60% of family members. A distinctive pattern of craniofacial abnormalities, including microcephaly and mandibular hyperplasia. A congenital heart defect that accounted for most infant mortality in the family. Most significantly, Dr. Wainwright's team identified a previously unknown autosomal recessive genetic mutation that appeared to be responsible for the neurological condition. This mutation affected the production of a specific protein involved in neurotransmitter metabolism, leading to the progressive deterioration of motor control. What we're seeing is essentially a new genetic disorder, Dr. Wainwright explained, one that likely existed as a recessive trait in the founding population but would normally remain unexpressed in a diversified gene pool. The practice of consanguineous marriage over multiple generations has effectively amplified this recessive trait to the point where it now dominates the family's medical landscape. The scientific community's initial reaction to the study was mixed. Some researchers questioned the ethics of studying what they considered a social problem rather than a medical one. Others recognized the valuable insight such isolated populations could provide for understanding human genetics more broadly. Dr. Martin Schreiber from Harvard Medical School noted in his review of the study, while the circumstances that created this genetic concentration are unfortunate, the scientific value of Dr. Wainwright's research cannot be overstated. The Shelton case provides a natural experiment that helps us understand how recessive disorders manifest and progress in human populations.